Mist sits like a slow tide over the quarry at dawn, wiping the world to silver and bone. A diver's lamp stabs through green water. A bell-like stone rings when it cracks the light. When the first workers saw the wall, they did not call it ancient so much as impossible. They called Mason King a dreamer then, an enthusiast with maps in his pocket and old receipts for stones. But dreams have a way of opening doors. He found the wall while following a line of scattered masonry that ran like a bruise across an abandoned field. The stones were not merely stacked, they fitted with a precision that quieted the laborers into a long, awkward silence. Men who had moved hay and raised barns for 40 years stood with hands on shovels and said nothing, then lit cigarettes and stared. "What is this?" they asked themselves aloud. No one knew. Imagine standing there with them, the sky at first pale, the air smelling faintly of iron and turned earth, something in the ground that refuses to be casual. The first paragraph is always the same. You come for an oddity and find a history that presses its face to yours. If you stood here among the mist and stone, what would you believe? The wall runs for nearly a quarter of a kilometer in a single, unnerving sweep. From above, it cuts a clean shadow across the meadow, a line that refuses to obey property boundaries or modern fences. Each block is a monolith of gray, some the size of a small cottage, others like crates. The faces are smooth to the eye and cruelly precise to the touch, as if measured with instruments that knew how to laugh at the hand that holds a tape. Where joints occur, the seams are hair-thin and unbroken by mortar. Where the stones contact, no visible tool marks betray the craft. The weight of certain units is estimated in the low tens of tons. No simple ramp explains how they were set. How, in a landscape of loam and small farms, did builders fashion and place such elements? No single explanation satisfies. Mainstream voices, archaeologists, engineers, offer pragmatic models, field survey, load calculations, quarry sourcing. They point out that mechanical advantage and coordinated labor can achieve wonders given time and resources. They are right, and yet the wall resists being smoothed into a paragraph of logistics. The enigma deepens when you examine one block close and find micro-polishing, concentric planar faces that reflect light like brushed steel, recent laboratory scans. Perhaps the builders had tools we call familiar. Perhaps they used methods buried in memory and ritual rather than blueprints. Perhaps the greatest mystery rests not in the stone but in the choice to make it so exacting. Consider the first measured reading. An outreach geophysicist noted a faint anomaly under the wall's central axis, a band of compacted, non-local sediment unlike the surrounding subsoil. Geophysical survey, recent. To a scientist, that note reads as a footnote in Earth's biography. To a storyteller, it is the place where a new chapter begins. There are other anomalies, an absence of animal burrows directly beneath certain stones, as if life knows not to disturb what was set long ago. A scattering of small worked fragments at regular intervals that suggests repeated human attention across generations. No one knows whether those hands set the stones or merely tended them. Local folklore offers different tones. Old women in the valley still whisper a name. The keeper's wall. Translated, the guardian's fence. They say the wall holds a seam in the earth where the river turned in its sleep. Such phrases are not proof, but they are not nothing either. Words like these keep alive the possibility that the structure's purpose was not mere enclosure. What was being kept, and from whom? The discovery story binds to human curiosity like ivy. Mason King, 40, thoughtful, with a jaw that remembered a smile, had been mapping old estate lines for a history society. He followed a hedgerow because a 19th century map suggested a boundary there. He bent to investigate a lump of stone at the roots and found something that did not belong. He wrote the first note in a ledger no one intended to read aloud. Within weeks the site drew attention, a local antiquarian, a university grad student who smelled thesis potential, a municipal official with worries about foundations. The scene became choreography, cordon tape, measured grids, careful flags like teeth on the green. Then the machines arrived. Mechanical excavation is an act of violence that often precedes revelation. The first trench revealed a dressed edge to the wall, and beneath it, traces of a compacted roadbed, wet clay layered and folded in a way that suggested repeated traffic, field stratigraphy, recorded. The road led neither to a known settlement nor to a quarry visible above ground. The absence of obvious origin points produced theories like smoke, caravan routes, displaced pueblos, an inland jetty to a vanished shore. Each theory tugged at one evidence thread and left the rest dangling. What is history but a set of later conveniences? Think of a mason lifting a block and placing it to a musician's metronome, or a priest arranging an altar so that moonlight would fall on a certain face at a certain hour. The wall asks us to imagine intention on a scale both practical and liturgical. Did the builders orient the wall toward a star? Toward a spring? Toward a field where the dead were gathered? Those questions are the marrow, not the bone. In the months after King's find, teams came and notebooks filled. Close-up macro photography revealed faint tool striations on hidden surfaces, parallel lines that argue for consistent tooling, perhaps abrasive stone or metal. Microscopy recorded. Portable XRF readings suggested the blocks are quartz-rich, with trace elements that might indicate a non-local source. Portable XRF survey, preliminary. The problem, beautiful, maddening, was that the supposed quarry lay in a low valley now covered by centuries of silt. No quarry face stood like testimony. The material could have been brought from distant heights, or from a bed that today sleeps under farmland. Either way, effort beyond the ordinary is implied. And yet, the wall is not monumental in the way a ruler's tomb is monumental. There are no sculpted panels boasting conquest or sacrifice. Instead, the faces are spare and shut-mouthed. That silence is louder than any inscription. What would you make of a wall that refuses narrative? It suggests functionality or sacredness, or both, something that answer seekers in two different languages can misinterpret. Not far from the central line of stones, a small depression holds water in the winter and a thin film of green in summer. Fishermen claim it is unlucky to drink from it. Children throw pebbles and dare one another not to whistle over its surface. Here and there ceramic sherds, scraps, peel back time in a way that is less imposing than intimate, a shard with a grooved rim, a bit of slipped wear with a charcoal smear. Pottery is a friend that tells us about household habits. The sherds imply that at some point the wall was in proximity to domestic life, not only ritual. If the builders intended to exclude something, they also built into an inhabited landscape. To understand a structure, you must imagine the making of it. Consider the practicalities: quarrying, shaping, transporting, setting. Each step demands organization, resources, timing. The precision of the seams suggests control over block geometry. To cut planes that mate to hairline tolerances requires measurement, and perhaps jigs. Did those who worked here use wooden templates worn by water and sun? Did they use abrasives and steady hand? Or did they use methods we cannot easily reconstruct? Lost rigs of ropes, sledges over wet clay, a seasonal workforce under a sky's good mood? You can assemble 1,000 possible workshops in your head, but none will feel wholly satisfactory. Then there are the small, maddening features. In one stone face, microscopists found a tiny circular cavity, less than 10 millimeters across and uniform in depth, a borehole as regular as a tooth. It sits at regular intervals along 3 stones, like punctuation. Someone, at some point, drilled a deliberate hole and stopped. Was it a template peg? A ritual notch? A design for a lost fixture? Such details teach us how limited our knowledge can be. We can map proportions and compositions and still be stymied by a single dot. Critics, always ready, pointed out that similar walls built in nearby regions in the last 1,000 years show comparable workmanship achieved by organized guilds. They suggest replication, not miracle. This is a reasonable stance. But the critics must also account for micro-polishing and the micro-cavities, features not readily explained by hobnailed labor alone. The scientific middle ground hums with possibility. The wall is exceptional but not supernatural, a product of human skill invested in a purpose we have yet to translate. There is also the temptation to find a narrative in the negative, absence as message. Where other monuments shout with iconography, this wall whispers by omission. The lack of burials, the lack of inscriptions, the absence of associated monumental architecture. These are data points. They tell us that if we are to understand the wall, we must not impose a burial template upon it. The people who built it may have been motivated by boundary maintenance, acoustical space, or alignments, practical, ritual, or a confusing mixture. To reveal intention, we must read choices rather than presuppose them. Time leaves the wall with edges softened but not explained. Weather rounds the corners, lichen eats the faces, and yet the fit persists. This persistence is a kind of stubborn testimony to craft. Even when abandoned, the structure continues to speak in the language of material. The most modern of voices, the laser scan enthusiasts, have argued that three-dimensional models reveal minute deviations consistent with successive resetting, later generations adjusting stones to maintain harmony. Laser scan survey, preliminary. If true, the wall was not a single act but a long conversation between people and place. At dusk, the local shepherd will tell you the wall hums. He does not mean a literal vibration but a quality of place, an attentiveness that draws the ear. He sits with his dog at the wall's edge and listens to night insects. It keeps the sheep, he says, as if the stone itself watches over the flock. Folklore and practical knowledge often coexist. We must treat such claims with respect without dissolving into credulity. Folktales are archives of relation. They tell us how people lived with the monument, how the monument shaped daily choices. Such stories can be as revealing as carbon dates. What is most disquieting is how the wall resists easy dating. Organic material is sparse, charred inclusions are few. Radiocarbon samples yield a scatter, a spread of dates that may reflect multiple episodes of use rather than a single construction event. Radiocarbon sampling, mixed contexts. Labs give ranges, ranges give hypotheses. Do the earlier dates mark an initial effort, and later ones maintenance? Or are some of the samples intrusive, older materials redeposited by later activity? Each sample is a voice in a choir. To make sense, we must learn to hear harmonies rather than single notes. You may wonder, what does the wall guard against? Geology offers one answer. There are fault lines not far from the site, and soils that shift underwater. A wall in such a context could serve to stabilize slopes or redirect runoff. The precision would then be engineering, not ritual. But precision for engineering is expensive. Only a society with resources and specialized labor invests in such extravagance for mundane ends. Or consider the alternative, a fence for the sacred, a barrier interposing human order against a place with unpredictable phenomena, springs that forget where they should run, winds that arrive cold in summer. Perhaps the wall was designed to modulate something less measurable than water, noise, the gaze of animals, the movement of stars. We circle back to Mason King, who told the local newspaper that night that he felt the stones watched him back. Journalists like that line. It reads as human vulnerability and supplies the story's heart. King later grew careful about his phrasing. Archaeology demands patience. But that first human moment captures the truth. An object becomes meaningful when a person notices it. The wall is now lodged in human awareness. It will not drop out of our cultural story again. As the field teams left their tapes and grids and went home to do the slow work, sampling, cataloging, writing, an argument began to shape itself on the margins of the science pages and social feeds. Some proposed that the wall was the remnant of a lost civilization. Others promoted the possibility of an industrial-scale Roman or late medieval project. A fringe voice floated a more provocative claim, that the stones show wear patterns inconsistent with any human tool known. The claim was brash and quickly rebutted by microscopists who pointed to plausible abrasive marks and weathering. The exchange did what good debate does. It clarified questions and narrowed wildness into a more focused mystery. And still the wall keeps giving subtle new problems. Surveyors found that a certain sequence of stones aligns, with striking precision, to a distant hilltop at sunrise on the equinox. Are such alignments deliberate or coincidental? Human builders have long used celestial markers for calendars and ritual. To the skeptic, this might be confirmation bias. To the sympathetic eye, it hints at intention and memory, a people who set stone to mark time. We must also attend to the human consequences of discovery. The field has become a focus of tourism, quiet at first, then more insistent. Amateur metal detectorists trudge in, leaving shallow scars. Contractors eye the stone as a resource. Local councils debate conservation plans and funding. The monument, if that is what it is, has entered the economy of meaning. Preservation is not only about maintaining material, it is about negotiating who gets to tell the story. If you stood at the wall now, you would notice the layer of modern interventions: survey stakes, numbered tags, the small padlock on a temporary gate. The modern world arrives like a fog too, overlaying planning permissions and grant applications over an older human conversation. Yet when you press your palm to the cold of a stone, those modern things fade to whisper. The stone returns your touch with the brief coolness of deep time. It invites you to imagine the hands that set it, and the hands that have loved and cursed it thereafter. So what to make of Mason King's impossible wall? Perhaps it is the compound answer of craft, labor, ritual, and environment, overlapping and imperfect, like a palimpsest of human intention. Perhaps it is the residue of a practice lost to us. Perhaps, most interestingly, it is a place that refused a tidy narrative and insisted instead upon a plurality of stories. In that refusal it becomes honest. The past is not a tidy archive we can file away, but a living place that continues to shape present choices. When the sun sets and the mist returns, the wall continues its silent work. The shepherd hollows a call across the field, the dogs answer. The stones cool and the stars tilt into place. No single explanation will satisfy every listener, and maybe that is the point. The enigma deepens, and in its deepening it invites us to keep looking. If you stood here with all this knowledge, maps, scans, sherds, what would you do next? Would you dig deeper, or would you listen longer? Would you push for excavation, or would you press for preservation? The questions are not merely academic, they determine future histories. The next morning the teams returned with quieter shoes and steadier hands. The cameras were packed away behind weathered tarps. A thin frost clung to the grasses, and the stones exhaled white plumes when the sun first touched them. Work slowed into the rhythm of careful unpeeling. Archaeology is, at its best, an art of patient subtraction. Remove what you must, preserve what you can, and read the residue. Trenches multiplied like tributaries off a main river. Each cut into the earth produced small economies of evidence: charcoal flecks, a shard here, a lens of gravel there. Every fragment demanded a ledger entry and a photograph taken at 3 angles. The meticulousness was almost devotional. If you have ever watched conservators in a lab, you know this look: the quiet concentration of people who respect the object because it resists haste. A cluster of post holes appeared a few meters beyond the wall, round and shallow, their fills dark with decayed organic material, field notes, stratigraphy recorded. The posts were not massive. They told of wooden structures perhaps ephemeral in life: fences, lean-tos, work platforms. Wood decays. Its absence tempts us to imagine permanence where there was none. The post holes, juxtaposed with enormous dressed stones, suggested a landscape of layered uses: monumental masonry and humble timber together, a place where grand design met everyday improvisation. Local voices began to cohere into something more than lore. An elderly mason named Baron, calloused hands, slow speech, eyes that narrowed at details, came to the site and crouched to touch the seams. He had worked stone his whole life and said simply, "They fit like a lock." His comment carried the weight of long apprenticeship. Craftsmen can sometimes detect method where scholars see only metrics. Baron suggested that the micro-polishing might be a side effect of centuries of maintenance: stones rubbed during seasons of repair, edges dressed to keep a smooth face. It is a modest hypothesis that reminds us craft continues. Structures are not only made once, they are made again and again by the hands that keep them. In the lab, thin sections were cut and scanned under polarized light. Mineralogists noted a high quartz content and a crystalline fabric consistent with a metamorphic source. Petrography, lab report. The trace element profile hinted at distant provenance, elements common in upland outcrops not present in the immediate valley soils. Portable XRF, corroborated. Transport across distances is plausible in any age where roads and labor allow it. The question slides back to cost. who bore the burden of moving multi-ton blocks across landscape. Labor organization is not miraculous. It is social capital manifested as muscle, skill, and planning. Then someone noticed a faint pattern, residues of an ochre pigment on the lower face of one stone, preserved in a hairline crevice as if painted then quickly rubbed away. Microscopy, pigment analysis pending. A trace of color reanimates an otherwise austere surface. Pigments speak of visibility, of surfaces meant to be seen, of faces that interacted with light and skin. Why paint a wall that otherwise avoids inscription? Perhaps certain faces were intended to catch ceremonies, or perhaps paint marked threshold points where people paused. Color is a small but potent language. Even a whisper of pigment can rewrite assumptions about purpose. Excavation also revealed a narrow channel running parallel to the wall, filled with a compacted, heterogeneous fill of gravel, charcoal, and small ceramics, stratigraphic record. Some teams suggested a drainage feature, others proposed a processional lane. Which is more likely, a practical accommodation for water, or a constructed path for bodies, of people or of objects, to move along? The dual possibility sums up the predicament. Structures often blend practical and ceremonial functions in ways modern categorizations struggle to separate. As weeks turned to months, ethical questions sharpened. A developer proposed a protective canopy, a tidy roof of glass and steel that would transform the site into a visitor center. The proposal promised funding and controlled visitation, but at a cost, altering landscape aesthetics, imposing a contemporary frame upon an ancient silence. Conservationists pushed back, favoring minimal intervention and a long-term management plan that emphasized community stewardship. Who decides a monument's future? The debate is more than bureaucratic. It is a moral negotiation about access, authority, and narrative ownership. Students and volunteers crowded the site in shifts, learning to trowel and to read strata. One afternoon, a grad student named Aisha found a small, intricately cut stone washer tucked between two larger blocks, an object so delicate it could have been lost in a farmer's pocket, field accession. The washer's fine finish suggested a specialist's touch. Objects like this are keys to technique. Were they part of a clamping system, pegs, or tools? Tiny artifacts become telescopes into otherwise invisible practices. A line of satellite images, when layered and compared, hinted at repetition, linear features beyond the inspected quarter kilometer that might extend the wall's logic, remote sensing analysis. Crop marks in dry seasons reveal subsurface anomalies, ghosts of walls, ditches, and pathways. Remote sensing is a satisfying discipline because it gives you the feeling of extending your hand beyond fences. It suggests the wall may be part of a more complex landscape architecture rather than an isolated oddity. That possibility magnetizes research funds and inevitably interpretation battles. On a stormy evening, a crackle of internet commentary blasted the site into a wider public. Someone posted a shaky drone clip and a speculative caption. Proof of unknown ancient tech? The clip went viral enough to draw a new round of attention and a new kind of pressure. Sensationalism flirts with discovery and sometimes suffocates nuance. The principal investigator, whose name had begun to appear in interviews, responded publicly with a calm admonition: evidence must be contextualized. Extraordinary claims need extraordinary proof. Her restraint reassured peers but did little to temper the flood of armchair theories, which ranged from the sublime to the absurd. One of the more thoughtful citizens' suggestions came from a retired engineer who submitted sketches of possible levering systems that could have permitted the placement of large blocks without modern cranes. His models, dated, humble, and mechanically plausible, were reminders that ingenuity often mimics available materials rather than inventing impossible tech. Such contributions can be useful. Archaeology prospers when scholars listen to craft knowledge outside academic corridors. Yet conflicting models proliferated, and the multiplicity of plausible reconstructions is itself a form of evidence. Human communities construct solutions within local constraints, and those solutions often leave overlapping but ambiguous signatures. The team organized a night of public engagement, slide talks, measured tours, and conversations at a marquee tent warmed with comradely tea. Villagers turned out in numbers, bringing stories their grandparents told. A woman named Layla recited a verse her grandmother had liked, a short couplet about a line in the ground that kept wolves from crossing. The verse was not data, but again it was not nothing. These words show the wall's effect on imagination across decades, a cultural echo. In the tense warm light, the wall felt less like an object to be owned and more like a shared theater of meaning. As scientific methods advanced, so did the possibilities for gentle investigation. Ground-penetrating radar traces suggested subsurface anomalies beyond initial trenches, pockets like lungs, while magnetometry identified localized magnetic highs that might indicate hearths or kills, geophysical survey, preliminary. These non-invasive techniques are gifts in contexts where excavation risks destroying the very patterns it seeks to reveal. They also introduce new puzzles. Anomalies are shapes without names until you have more context to read them. At the edge of the site, a small, unremarkable stone bore an incised line barely visible to the naked eye. Under raking sunlight, it resolved into a low-relief sketch, not a script but a symbol, an interlaced ring that recurred on several broken sherds, iconographic note. The repetition suggested a mark of identity, perhaps a clan sign, a workshop emblem, or a ritual motif. Symbols are stubbornly ambiguous, but they are a long human habit, to mark, to own, to bless. If a motif repeats across different material classes, we can tentatively link social networks or production systems. Legalities crept in like moss. Claims of ownership surfaced. A land registry produced a map showing competing claims dating to different centuries. The municipal records, brittle with ink and stamp, were also human documents with errors and omissions. Heritage law requires a delicate dance. The state often asserts control to protect, but local stakeholders want agency. The debate took a formal turn when a temporary injunction halted machine work pending a fuller assessment. The pause was ugly for some, delays mean costs, but for others it was a breath of relief. Conservationists used the time to design monitoring plans and to train local custodians. Scientific curiosity, however, did not sleep. A new, non-destructive technique, microerosion analysis, was proposed to estimate surface exposure times of the stone faces, microerosion method proposal. If reliable, it could give a window into when surfaces were set or last abraded. The method is slow and requires calibration against local weathering rates, but it promised a way to bracket relative chronology without invasive sampling. Technology often provides new lenses. Sometimes it gives us better questions rather than final answers. Rumors, inevitably, found their way into the story. Someone suggested secret chambers. Another whispered of metal artifacts seized by a collector in a nearby town. Rumor is a cultural sediment. It tells less about the site than about anxieties around ownership and discovery. Responsible stewardship fights rumor with transparency and community engagement, and so the team opened a modest display in the village hall, labeled finds, explanations of methods, and a board for questions. The exhibit transformed suspicion into curiosity. It turned strangers into participants. As seasons cycled, the wall revealed small signs of deliberate modification: stones reset, tool marks refreshed, minor repairs likely carried out by successive generations, field stratigraphy, laser scan comparison. That evidence supports a life of maintenance, not simple abandonment. Structures that matter to societies are rarely left to rot at once. They are tended, argued over, and adapted. The act of maintenance itself is a form of social memory. Hands repeat gestures across time to keep a meaning alive. At the end of the year, under a sky hammered with winter light, the principal investigator gathered the team beneath the arch of a temporary shelter and read preliminary conclusions aloud. They were careful, impatiently careful. The wall is composite in history. Multiple episodes of construction, repair, and intentional design are likely. The data does not yet support grand claims of unknown technology. It does, however, support a narrative of high skill, organized labor, and a cultural decision to invest in a precise stone line whose function blended the practical and the symbolic. The conclusion felt both satisfying and insufficient. Satisfying because it grounded speculation, insufficient because many particular questions remained open. One unresolved detail remained stubborn and haunting: a narrow, dark seam found beneath a coped stone that resisted explanation. Within it, isolated and astonishing, rested a small object of worked bone, 4 millimeters long, polished to translucence and pierced by a hole too small for modern threading, micro-artifact accession. It was not monumental in any traditional sense, but it possessed a peculiar intimacy. Someone had placed it below the stone and then sealed it with earth. Was it a maker's token, a charm, a marker for a setting operation? The choice to conceal a small, delicate object beneath tons of rock carried intention. It was an intimate vote embedded in a grand project. The bone piece demanded humility. We cannot, from a work sliver, reconstruct motives with certainty. But we can respect the human tenderness of that action. Someone thought small things mattered even within great works. It changed the tenor of the site for many. The wall became a place of contact, not merely an engineering problem. Layers of practice and belief overlapped. The monumental and the domestic found themselves in an awkward, revealing embrace. If you read the records now, field journals, lab notes, scanned images, you will see a map of accumulating care and caution. The wall resists tidy endings. It insists, instead, on a slow choreography: public meetings and private notes, pigment traces and satellite images, local verses and lab spectra. To listen to it is to accept complexity. So the work goes on, more analyses queued, more community consultations scheduled, an ethics review pending, and the perpetual tension between protection and knowledge unresolved. In that tension the site thrives as a locus of questions. The wall's meaning is not a sealed answer but an invitation, a place where human hands, over many seasons, negotiated how to make boundary and meaning coincide. Night settles in the field early now. A light in the excavation tent blinks like an eye. The team locks equipment in small cores and walks home beneath a sky freckled with cold stars. Somewhere beyond the meadow, a fox moves and is gone. The stones lie patient and exact, their seams catching a titiline of moon. No single story will exhaust them, no single hearing will render them mute. What will future hands do here? Will they continue to coax information out of place, or will they choose to preserve mystery? The decision belongs not only to specialists but to communities, to citizens of time who must decide whether to lay the past flat and catalogued, or to keep its edges sharp so that wonder survives. A wind rises off the plain and carries a rind of cold across the stones. It sounds almost like breath. Under the light of headlamps, a narrow aperture opens like a pupil in the base of the wall. Team members crouch, the quiet broken only by the rustle of jackets and the scrape of a trowel. What was first thought to be a packing void turns out to be a deliberately cut recess, too regular to be accident, too small to be convenient. Someone has made a pocket in the stone and then, with care, closed it over. The pocket yields its secret slowly. Inside, wrapped in a fragile weave of plant fiber that has become a dark, papery thing, lies a bundle of thin metal strips and a chip of polished obsidian, micro-artifact accession. Conservation pending. The metal is corroded to a pale green crust, but when a conservator isolates a sliver it speaks, hammered, not cast, with a hammered seam that implies repeated human shaping rather than smelting on an industrial scale, metallographic note. The obsidian shard holds a micro-polish on one face, like a blade used for a precise, domestic task. Who concealed these items beneath granite? What small ceremony or small superstition led someone to tuck such delicate things under tremendous weight? For a week the site hums with the sound of cautious optimism. Conservators set up controlled humidity tents. Chemists prepare microsamples for trace analysis. A materials specialist photographs the metal at magnification until the room looks like a watchmaker's lab. The metal, preliminary tests suggest, is an alloy rich in tin and copper, but with trace elements that do not neatly match known regional composites. Elemental analysis, preliminary. The anomaly is small enough to be footnoted and large enough to insist upon explanation. Trade networks? Local experimentation? A maker's improvised alloy? Each option opens a corridor of further inquiry. Night experiments begin almost by accident. A researcher brings a pair of microphones and asks a simple question: Does the wall do anything to sound? When a drum is struck near the seam, a low harmonic lingers longer than expected, a note that seems to live in the stone for a second more than physics would promise. Acoustic test, recorded. To the ears of the team it feels like an echo from the past, an acoustic memory. Was sound part of the wall's purpose, sound as marker, as ritual boundary, as deterrent? If stone can hold a tone, could it also hold intentionality? A rumor surfaces that a small, hidden chamber exists where surface scans show only a whisper. The rumor is neither proof nor nonsense. It gets the team moving. They lay a micro-transect of sensors, careful to disturb as little as possible. The instruments show a discrete hollow with a geometry inconsistent with simple packing voids, a cavity with a shallow floor and a gently canted northern face. It is small, human-sized, and it seems to have been sealed from within, not from without. GPR and muon-like sensitivity readings, preliminary. To be sealed suggests intentional closure. To be small suggests purpose intimate and deliberate. Did someone place an object there for safekeeping, or did they place themselves? Local elders lean into the question with fairy tale patience. They used to close things up so the world could not get in, says an elder whose family has lived within sight of the wall for generations. He traces imagined patterns in the air with a thumb as if carving invisible seams. Such statements are not archaeological proof, but they are ethnographic texture, a people's habits toward concealment, secrecy, remembrance. How often did communities mark their private reckonings in public stone? The conservators choose a single tiny object for risky, reversible intervention, a sliver of the metal bundle. Under the microscope, after a careful desalination bath, trace residues form like early maps, organic residues that smell faintly of resin and of hearth smoke when warmed. Residue analysis, lab note. The presence of resin hints at a sealing practice, a conscious attempt to keep moisture and the world of microbes at bay. Hearth smoke suggests domestic contexts. The intersection of ritual sealing and household materials suggests that the line between sacred and everyday life at the site has always been indistinct. Political pressure accumulates like rain clouds. A municipal election approaches and candidates start to use the wall as rhetoric. Some promise preservation funds, others suggest a heritage park to stimulate tourism and jobs. Words like development and investment slide into archaeological discussions with awkward ease. The principal investigator insists on a slow approach, publish data first, invite stakeholder councils, seek consensus. Slowness feels like a sacrament. Will the community value careful knowledge more than immediate gain? An obscure archival map surfaces in a provincial record office. The kind of brittle, stained thing that smells of damp and ink. The map, drawn in an 18th century hand, shows a continuous stone line that roughly corresponds to the present wall but ends abruptly at a stream labeled with an old name, archival source, cadastral, 1768. The cartographer's line suggests continuity and an older memory of the feature. If 18th century surveyors saw a remnant, the wall's visible history extends deeper into modern memory than previously thought. Maps are argument and artifact both. They tell us how the past was read by later hands. Field teams begin experimental archaeology to test practical models. They assemble teams to replicate block movement using only period-appropriate technologies, aided rollers, wet clay sledges, counters by ropes, and human choreography. The experiments produce surprising clarity. Blocks of a certain size can be moved short distances with astonishing economy if rollers and softening lubricants are used correctly, and if work pauses are scheduled to match tides or seasonal thaw cycles. Practical ingenuity reduces the space for mystique but does not erase wonder. The skill required is still formidable and requires social organization and persistent craft knowledge. The wall could thus be built by hands like ours, given time, skill, and will. Yet some elements continue to resist simple practicality. The hairline tolerances, the polish and hidden seams, the micro-cavities. These suggest that something more than brute force was valued. There is artistry in constraint. When the team compares the wall's measured tolerances to those of nearby known workshops, they find only partial overlap. The wall's standards are higher in certain dimensions but lower in others, comparative metric study. Those variances argue for a hybrid cultural logic. The builders aimed for precision where meaning demanded it, and economized where it did not. A late winter morning reveals another surprise: an informal ritual, performed in secret by a small group of villagers, leaves ephemeral traces, coins, flowers, a written note in a modern language placed in a crack and quickly removed by a team member to preserve context. The ritual is not ancient, it is contemporary, an act of everyday meaning-making. People in the valley have adopted the wall into their personal practices. Heritage, therefore, is not only about the ancient hands that set stone but also about modern hands that find in those stones a place to mark grief, hope, or gratitude. Then, just when the narrative seems ready to settle into respectable academic channels, a night theft is foiled. A would-be metal salvager, an opportunist hoping to pluck corroded fittings for scrap, gets tangled in a monitoring line and alerts the team. The incident is small and humiliating for the thief but consequential for the project. It exposes vulnerability. Even quiet sites can find themselves prey to economic desperation. It also clarifies priorities. Security and community engagement must walk hand in hand. Preservation requires social care as much as technical intervention. The bone token resurfaces in conversation, now framed with a different tone. Some suggest it is a maker's charm, a small object placed by a craftsman for luck. Others argue it is a measurement shim used to calibrate a template, and then left accidentally or intentionally. Both readings fit the artifact. Both open different emotional registers. The maker's charm is intimate and human. The shim is practical and impersonal. Which is it? Perhaps both. Human choices are seldom pure. A summer survey employing aerial lidar finally yields a broader picture: faint linear terraces, subtle banks, and a scattering of small enclosures arrayed around the wall like satellites. The lidar strips the vegetation away and reveals the topography as a plan, an ordered landscape that suggests long-term land management and social structuring. LiDAR survey processed. The wall is no longer an isolated marvel but a spine in a lived ecology. Drainage, field terraces, and habitation traces align with its course. The more the team learns, the more the wall appears embedded in a system of human dealings with water, soil, and seasonal movement. Amid all this data, nights at the site grow ritualized. The core team meets in a hut near the trench beneath lantern light and shares small, unguarded moments. A bottle passed, a child's drawing pinned to a cupboard, the quiet of maps spread like confessionals. Mason King visits sometimes and stands at the edge of the plans as if listening. Once, he places his palm on a stone and closes his eyes as if in prayer or calculation. The gesture is small, human, and it reminds the team why they do this work: to hold a fragile dialogue with hands long gone. If the wall teaches one thing above all, it is that layers of human intent accrete like strata in the ground, sometimes predictable, often enigmatic, always more than a simple narrative. Who built it, why, and for whom remain questions with many provisional answers. The project becomes not a march toward finality but a communal experiment in humility. Document carefully, preserve conscientiously, and listen to voices, scientific, local, skeptical, because each adds a facet to the wall's evolving story. What new secrets will the next season yield? Will the sealed cavity lead to a more complex set of deposits, or will it remain a small and stubborn mystery? The field becomes a kind of moral testing ground. How do we balance the hunger for knowledge with the duty to protect? The answer is not technical alone, it is ethical. A thin rain begins and the stones smell like cold iron. Excavation resumes in a slow choreography: grid flags, measured trowel sweeps, fingers tracing the lexicon of soil. Each careful scrape writes a sentence in the site's accumulating autobiography. Winter gives way to a wet spring, and with the thaw comes an unexpected breath of urgency. A university team secures emergency funding to run an extended season. New specialists in dendrochronology, sedimentology, and archaeoacoustics arrive with crates of instruments and the soft excitement of people who read things the rest of the world calls obscure. They set up a small lab in the village hall. Microscopes hum, computers glow with topographic meshes, and a whiteboard carries hypotheses like constellations, some bright, some tentative. One morning a slender post remnant emerges from a sealed deposit, its wood dark but preserved where clay kept oxygen away. A sample is taken, then braced with resin and air freighted to a lab for tree-ring analysis. Dendrochronology sample, dispatched. If the rings can be matched to a regional sequence, they will yield calendar years, a kind of temporal key. The team waits the slow arc of lab schedules. Archaeology is often a discipline of patience disguised as frenetic work. Will the wood tell us when a platform stood, when repairs were last made, or when a ritual boundary was reset? Time, in rings, can answer with decade-fine mercy. Aisha, whose hands have become careful and sure, finds herself at the center of a contentious moment. She uncovers a shallow pit lined with small flat slabs. Inside, charcoal flecking and a scattering of tiny beads suggest an assemblage that reads like a domestic altar, field accession. Her supervisor wants the context sampled immediately. A local resident asks for time to perform a private offering before the trench is closed. They compromise, a simple, supervised moment of respect, a few whispered words, then careful bagging. The exchange is small but instructive. Archaeology does not simply take. It negotiates with living communities about how the dead or the past should be treated in the present. The dendro result comes back weeks later and delivers a jolt. The timber dates to a ring set consistent with the second half of the 16th century. Dendrochronology, calibrated range. It is not an epoch-making date, but it situates a phase of activity, maintenance or reworking during a period of significant social change in the region. The timeline now reads as palimpsest, a structure built and rebuilt, a place that mattered in different social orders. Chronology narrows possibilities and opens new questions. What social pressures in the 16th century would compel such an investment in stone? Trade, conflict, ritual reinvention? Meanwhile, acoustic experiments deepen into a serious inquiry. The archaeoacoustic team constructs a controlled array, drums, reed instruments, an artificial voice box that sings tones at precise frequencies. When certain notes are played, standing waves form along short stretches of the wall, emphasizing harmonics at intervals that correspond to seam spacing. Acoustic array tests, recorded. The phenomenon is subtle. Sound is not trapped forever, but certain frequencies linger in pockets like verbal ghosts. Could the wall have been tuned, deliberately shaped so that the landscape itself sings on particular occasions? The idea is not proof of sacred theater, but it does suggest a sensory logic beyond visual visibility. As results circulate in preprint reports and internal memos, the project draws a wider, more formal attention. A National Heritage Agency proposes an interdisciplinary research park centered on the site, combining conservation training, public outreach, and a small protective perimeter. The proposal is generous but also bureaucratic. It promises resources but asks for oversight. Local leaders negotiate terms, jobs for village youth, joint management, and a commitment to preserve access for traditional practices. The agreement, when struck, is imperfect but is hailed as a model for participatory heritage. Who benefits from discovery? The question molds policy and shapes stories. Not all attention is benign. A sharp op-ed accuses the team of colonializing the landscape, an argument that stings and forces reflection. The criticism points to a long history of outside experts arriving with bags of instruments, and a confidence that sometimes erases local voices. The principal investigator hears the critique, and in a public forum concedes mistakes, communication gaps, hurried language in press releases, and outlines steps to correct course, shared publications, local co-authorship, and free training workshops. It is a small rhetorical repair, but it matters. The ethical framing of research becomes part of the data set. How we study changes how the past is returned to a people. On a clear morning, a surveyor notices a faint painted line at the core of a seam, pigment preserved by a micro-overhang that sheltered it from rain. The pigment chemistry is unusual, iron-rich but bound with an organosynthetic binder that signals a technique not commonly used in the immediate region, pigment analysis, preliminary. If confirmed, it may indicate trade of materials or technique exchange, craft knowledge crossing social boundaries. Color again insists that the wall was not simply utilitarian, it was also a surface of attention. A modest controversy flares over public interpretation. A popular magazine runs a speculative long read linking the wall to a lost cult of stone, with colorful language and dramatic photos. The piece draws visitors by the busload and spawns merch, cheap replicas, postcards, and a faux ritual charm sold at the edge of the site. The team worries: commodification can flatten nuance. The village economy hums with new trade, ice cream stalls, guides selling embroidered bandanas, but the site's scientific process feels crowded by spectacle. How do you translate careful nuance in the glare of popular appetite? Meanwhile, materials specialists examine the metal strips recovered from the pocket. Metallography reveals lamination and hammer welding techniques consistent with hand-forging traditions, but the trace element anomalies persist, tiny inclusions that may reflect mineral impurities from an unfamiliar source. Metallographic analysis noted. The conservators speculate. Perhaps a tin source brought through maritime trade, perhaps a local artisan experimenting with alloys. The metal refuses to be mundane. Its chemistry is a map of connection. Late in the season, the team opens a narrow sondage at an outlying terrace revealed by LiDAR. Beneath a thin plowsoil they find a scatter of animal bones and burnt seeds, evidence of routine diets and agricultural practice that anchor the wall in the rhythms of daily life. Ecofacts, flotation results pending. People lived and worked around it. They did not revere it from a distance. The presence of charred cereal tells of field management, and perhaps of seasonal gatherings. The wall forms part of an economy as much as of a cosmology. Human stories weave through the science. Baron the Mason brings his grandson to the site, and teaches him how to read a seam. The boy's fingers mimic old gestures: slide, assess, pat. Mason King sends occasional letters with sketches of a childhood landscape and a plea for patience. Aisha receives a scholarship to continue her studies and promises to return to lead future work. Small personal arcs deepen the sense that the project is not only about stones but about people whose lives the stones now touch. The season ends with a careful backfill and the installation of monitoring instruments that will watch micro-movement, moisture, and visitor impact. The site is stabilized, fragile but responsibly held. A public day is held with talks, a small exhibit, and an open trench for children to peer into, a measured performance of transparency. Questions still cluster like birds, about production, about purpose, about the social world that invested in precision. The wall's voice is becoming clearer in some regions and, crucially, complicated. It is not a monolith of single meaning but a palimpsest of intentions. If you walk the line now, you will find it alive in new ways, graffiti not by vandalism but by careful tags indicating survey points, trodden not only by scholars but by villagers who bring bread to stones in a quiet, modern ritual. The wall belongs to many temporalities: the hands that set, the hands that set again, and the hands that set a mobile phone to record the light in the seam. How will future narratives treat this layered belonging? Will historians write of it as a case of communal stewardship, or as an object expropriated by spectacle? No one knows every answer. The point of excavation is not to close a question so much as to rephrase it with better evidence. And so the work continues, slow, collaborative, occasionally contentious, each season a page, each sample a footnote. The wall persists in resisting tidy classification. It demands that we accept complexity as a kind of truth. If you have learned anything from walking these stones, it is this: human projects are rarely single-purpose. They fold function into meaning, labor into prayer, utility into beauty. The wall holds those folds like a seam. At dusk, after the tents are quieted and the village returns to its ordinary life, a group of teenagers gather by the outer line and experiment with tones, singing, drumming, listening to the way their voices change when they stand in certain niches. They laugh and then fall silent as the tone lingers longer than any of them expected. They look at one another with the peculiar adult astonishment that comes when the world refuses to be explainable on the first pass. If the wall keeps a memory of sound, who will make the next song? If it keeps a memory of care, who will be the next hand that tightens a seam? The questions are practical and poetic at once. They are the reason we keep digging, keep listening, keep arguing with stone. A cold fog slides along the stones like an old shawl, settling into seams and making the air taste of river and metal. By mid-season, a pattern emerges in the team's notebooks. The wall is a ledger of choices. Some choices are technical: how to set a block, how to keep a seam hair thin, while others are social: who gets to decide when a stone needs replacing, who pays for the labor, who prays at the seam. Those overlaps make the archaeology messy and human. An autumn field day brings an unexpected find: a cache of plant fibers pressed into a shallow recess between two blocks. Their weave faint but coherent under magnification, conservation accession. When conservators teased the fibers apart, they discovered a smear of resin and the ghost of pigments, traces consistent with an organic wrapper, perhaps a protective cloth for a small ritual object. The presence of textiles, even in fragmentary form, opens an intimate window into hands that touch the wall: cloth that softened metal, cloth that wrapped small votive things, cloth that carried scents and skin. At the same time, analysis of microwear on certain seam faces yields another surprise: repetitive striations consistent with a tool held at a consistent angle and applied with great patience. Microwear microscopy, lab note. The marks are not errors of haste. They are the signature of a practiced hand. Who trained those hands? Was there a guild of stoneworkers with apprentices and rituals of initiation? The question pushes the narrative from anonymous labor to social organization, a community of craft where knowledge passed in deliberate sequences. The regional archives, dustier now with requests and careful hands, provide marginalia, clipped notations in estate ledgers about boundary stones sold or leased in decades past. Archival marginalia, 1821 to 1894. Those mundane bureaucratic records are the kind of evidence historians love because they show interaction across centuries: landholders, taxes, contested fences. The wall is implicated each time as both legal marker and social artifact. Documents suggest phases: when the line was repaired in response to floods, when it was surveyed to settle disputes, when new owners questioned old rights. The wall lives in paper as well as in stone. A late-night acoustic experiment pushes the team toward a surprising idea. Using harmonic analysis, researchers isolate a set of frequencies that amplify when the wall is struck in particular locations. The frequencies correspond to notes that are comfortably sung by a tenor range and that resonate longest in early evening conditions when humidity is higher. Acoustic modeling, recorded. The result is not proof of ritual music, but it suggests a sensory design, a wall that interacts differently with human voice and the weather. Could occasions of singing and storytelling have been part of the wall's life cycle? Imagining crowds lining a stone spine to watch sound bloom is both plausible and achingly cinematic. Arguments continue to form around the meaning of small ritual deposits. One morning, an elderly villager brings an old photograph of a family gathering by the outer line, black and white, faces bright, a picnic laid directly beside the stones. The image is not archaeological data in the classical sense, but it is ethnographic proof that the wall has been a stage for social life across generations. The past is not a remote country but an inhabited room whose floorboards creak with familiar footsteps. Controversy simmers under the surface as well. A vocal online community insists on a dramatic reinterpretation. The wall is an acoustic observatory used by priest technicians to amplify or silence particular frequencies for ritual control. The theory, speculative and theatrical, spurs an influx of curious visitors trying their voices at the seams. The site's caretakers worry about where preservation strategies shift to account for human interaction, how to allow wonder without destroying the very features that produce it. It is an ethical puzzle: accessibility versus preservation, imagination versus evidence. In the field, a young technician named Musa discovers a small assemblage of nails and a burned wood fragment nestled in a later repair context. The nails are hand-forged, their heads asymmetrical, and the char suggests a repair lit by accident or by intention, field accession. The context tells of episodic maintenance, storms, accidental fires, or deliberate ritual burning associated with repair practices. Maintenance, again, shows the wall as a lived object, not a static relic. Seasonal wind brings scattered seeds and, with them, botanical clues. Phytolith analysis of soil samples collected in carefully recorded stratigraphic layers reveals a pattern of cultivated grasses and wild plants consistent with both pastoral use and small-scale agriculture. Phytolith results, pending. The wall runs through a managed landscape. It marked fields and guided water. It possibly organized grazing routes. Its precision may have been justifiable in practical planning as much as in symbolic talk. At a public forum, an elder speaks with surprising bluntness. "We never owned the wall," she says. "We grew up with it like weather." Her remark reframes ownership as relation rather than possession. People who live near monuments often develop an attitude of custodianship without claims of proprietary control, and that sentiment can be a powerful conservation ally. It also brings forward the ethical imperative. The research cannot pretend the wall sits in a vacuum. The site is entangled in living memory. Experts test the metal strips again with refined isotopic assays and return results that complicate the narrative. Trace isotopes point toward ore sources consistent with coastal deposits in some elements, and upland deposits in others. Isotopic analysis, refined. The picture is of a connected world, materials moving along networks of exchange, or artisans experimenting with blended resources. Trade, mobility, and innovation are possible threads in the wall's tapestry. Late one night, a student on the team, sorting photos, notices a correlation. The seam cavities that contain the smallest votive objects are located at intervals that match no obvious agricultural or topographic logic. They are instead spaced with a rhythm that, when measured, corresponds closely to certain lunar declination cycles. Patterning analysis, preliminary. The finding is tentative and must be tested, but it invites a haunting idea that the placement of intimate deposits might have been synchronized with celestial events, small rituals timed with cycles of the moon. Ritual time, in this picture, becomes as important as calendar time. The international press lends a mixed hand. Careful journals publish sober papers about technique and context, while lifestyle magazines favor glossy spreads of the most photogenic stones with headlines about mystery and secrecy. The team learns to shepherd narratives with patience, to keep the science front and center while allowing the public to be captivated. Outreach programs expand. Guides trained in heritage interpretation lead respectful visits, school programs introduce young people to site stewardship, and an open-access database publishes non-sensitive data for researchers worldwide. Knowledge dissemination becomes part of the preservation ethic. Practically, conservation decisions accumulate. A microclimate monitoring system records freeze-thaw cycles, and engineers design reversible supports to relieve stress on the most vulnerable seams. Conservation design, recommended. Plans are made to use breathable consolidants where needed and to employ traditional mortaring techniques in areas where historical repairs had used lime. The project builds an approach that blends modern science with craft traditions, acknowledging that sometimes the best conservation mimics the logic that once sustained the structure. The wall's cultural afterlife becomes apparent in small human gestures. An artist from the nearest town starts a residency, sketching the seam lines and making ink rubbings that she then gifts to the local school. A musician composes a piece inspired by the wall's resonant frequencies and performs it in the village square. These are not data, but they are testimony to the wall's continuing role as a generator of meaning. Heritage is alive when it evokes creation in the present. As winter approaches again, the team prepares a synthesis report for the heritage authorities and local stakeholders. The report is careful and layered, timelines with ranges, models of construction with degrees of plausibility, and a suite of recommended conservation actions. Most importantly, it argues for a living stewardship model, training local custodians, preserving access for traditional practices, and committing to a long-term plan that balances knowledge generation and protection. The report is more than technical output, it is an ethical charter. In quiet moments, when the field tents are empty and the instruments sleep, someone walks the wall alone, hand trailing along the hairline joins. The touch is a ritual of attention rather than ownership. The stones are cool and honest under the palm. The wall keeps secrets and offers gestures. It is, finally, an argument between past and present about what matters. If you have followed this work closely, the question remains, what do you do with that knowledge? Do you make a museum of the site, freeze it into a narrative, and put it under glass? Or do you continue the slow conversation, repairing, documenting, and inviting communities to steward the place with you? The answer is practical and moral. It asks us to weigh the hunger for explanation against the duty to protect living memory. At dawn, a messenger arrives with a note, an invitation from a neighboring region to compare walls, a request for dialogue, not for conquest. The field team replies with eagerness. The wall has been a line that separated fields. Now it becomes a line of connection, between scholars, between communities, and between the past and a future that must decide how to listen. Night thins into a pale wash of pre-dawn. The sight sleeps with instruments that blink like patient eyes. The months of measurement, listening, and slow argument alchemize into a quieter truth. The wall is not a single answer but a living archive, an object that records choices, repairs, songs, and the small gestures of people who lived beside it. It holds engineering and ritual in the same seam, practical design braided with human attention. This is the chimney of meaning where labor, belief, and environment have smoked together for generations. In the epilogue of this work we must attend to the tenderness of small things, the bone token tucked in a pocket of stone, the fragment of cloth preserved by clay, the measured strike that makes a tone linger. These are not grand revelations, but they are the most honest ones. They teach us that monumental effort and domestic care are siblings. A society capable of moving multi-ton blocks also preserve tiny objects with the same deliberate touch. The wall's story is therefore social at its base. Networks of labor, exchange in metals and pigments, isotopic and pigment analyses, apprenticeship and maintenance, field notes, comparative metric study, and this social life is what makes interpretation possible and humane. We end where the work began, with questions that refuse tidy resolution and with a set of practices that answer ethically and practically. The scientific record now contains calibrated tree ring dates that anchor episodes of repair, dendrochronology, lab report, LiDAR maps that show terraces and field systems connecting the wall to daily economies, LiDAR survey processed, and acoustic data that reveal how the structure interacts with human voice and weather, archaeoacoustic recordings. Together these strands do not collapse into a single narrative but instead form a network of plausible lives. Farmers who timed repairs by seasons, masons who rehearsed the craft across generations, ritual moments timed with lunar cycles, and communities that continued to fold the stones into memory. There are moral obligations threaded through the conclusion. Discovery cannot be divorced from stewardship. The team's long dialogue with villagers, the co-authored conservation plan, and the training programs for local custodians are part of the archaeological output as much as radiocarbon tables. Heritage is not a museum placement, but a living agreement between past responsibilities and present needs. Decisions to limit visitor access, to prioritize reversible conservation techniques, and to publish openly while protecting sensitive data are not merely technical choices. They are ethical commitments to keep the wall both intelligible and intact. Still, some mysteries remain stubborn and beautiful in their resistance. The precise provenance of the alloy in the secret bundle resists simple attribution. The micro-polish in inner seams suggests a care whose logic we can approximate but not completely reconstruct. The acoustic harmonics invite speculation about ritualized sound but stop short of proof. These unresolved items are not failures. They are invitations. They ask future hands for more careful listening, for replication experiments, for dialogic scholarship that blends craft knowledge, local memory, and laboratory rigor. The final lesson the wall offers is one of humility. Stone endures, people do not. Yet the real endurance is not merely material, it is knowledge made by repetition and care. When the community mends a seam, birds nest near repaired joints, and children sing in niches, the monument continues as a locus of life. To treat it as an object of pure curiosity is to sterilize a living relation. Instead, the project pivots toward a stewardship that is generous and shared. At the closing public symposium, the principal investigator stands beneath a low winter sun and speaks less of conclusive answers than of collaborative processes. She names the many hands, Baron's apprenticeship, Aisha's patient cataloging, the village elders' stories, that made interpretation possible. The speech is not triumphalist, it is careful and grateful. The audience applauds not for closure but for an ethic of inquiry that respects both evidence and the people who live with it. In the long frame, the wall becomes a teacher. It instructs in methods: how to read soil, how to listen for sound, how to calibrate a microerosion test, but it also instructs in temperance: how to balance the hunger for explanation with the duty to protect, how to translate wonder into work, and how to let mystery persist without exploitation. The most modern technologies, LiDAR, isotopic assays, acoustics, do not replace local knowledge, they amplify it when used in partnership. The wall's meaning grows when technologies and traditions converse. When you visit the site years hence, you may find a careful canopy, a set of explanatory panels co-authored with community voices, monitoring sensors humming quietly, and children's chalk drawings pinned to a notice board. You may also find a seam rubbed smooth by many palms, an almost invisible smear of ochre in a protected crevice, and a small, carefully conserved case in the village hall holding the obsidian shard and the folded metal strips, objects whose fragility reminds us of human tenderness amid engineering. Perhaps the greatest comfort is this: the wall's continued existence is the product of ongoing choices, not inevitable fate. People chose, at many moments, to mend rather than dismantle, to listen rather than commodify, to teach rather than conceal. Those choices are the living addendum to any technical report. They are the final work of which archaeologists are custodians for a season. So what remains? A set of proposals for future research, targeted micro-excavations in partnership with local custodians, refined isotopic mapping to track material flows, acoustic performance studies designed with community participation, and an oral history program to capture stories before memory dims. These steps are modest but purposeful. They are designed to widen who gets to tell the wall's story rather than to close that story prematurely. In the end, the wall's voice is both material and metaphor, a line in the landscape that once organized water, labor, and sound, a seam where care and ceremony were practiced, a teacher for those who wish to learn to read complexity. It resists tidy myths and invites careful wonder. It asks us to remember that the past is always in conversation with the present, and that to hear it we must speak softly, work patiently, and share stewardship broadly. 3 lines close this tale like a small benediction: the stones keep their cool and their secrets. We keep our questions. Hands that set and hands that tend are the same hands, across time. Listen long enough. Sometimes the world answers in a tone you did not expect.